The boxing community in Dallas is pretty small. Kids get to know each other pretty fast.
They was good kids. Flat out, simple, good kids, too good for this world.
Police received calls about shots fired.
The officers get to the park. A lot of people are scattering.
There is a young man lying on the ground with a bullet wound to his head.
Everybody who's present is a suspect.
It was a lot of rumors going around.
Obviously, there was conversations trying to devise a plan to get revenge.
They took their room and they ran with it.
I remember talking to my partner and saying, did he get the wrong guy?
It's April 25th, 2021, in DeSoto, Texas, a suburb of Dallas.
At around 6:22 p.m., police received calls about shots fired at Les Zeiger Park.
Patrol officers responded to that immediately. They get to the park. A lot of people are scattering. People are getting in cars and driving off.
There is a young man lying on the ground with a bullet wound to his head.
Police actually tried to do first aid. They were trying to apply pressure. They were trying to put a towel on his head. At one point, he actually tried to stand up.
The injured man is unable to identify himself.
He was very frantic, laying on the ground with blood coming out of his head. We quickly got our ambulance there and our paramedics. They loaded him up and went, and he was still alive.
By then, only a few witnesses remain.
The initial detectives arrive at the scene and try to get some information. Nobody was really talking. We had no idea who this individual was that was shot.
Investigators do learn the crowd had gathered to memorialize a different shooting victim.
They were at the park for a balloon release memorial for another young man, 19-year-old Cameron Collier.
The witnesses that patrol officers did talk to did want to give any information. They all kind of had the same line. I heard a pop and I thought it was a balloon. Then I looked around.
They looked and saw the victim on the ground, but they did not say that they knew who the perpetrator was.
I think it's they just didn't want to get involved, right? And I can understand that. It's frustrating, right, as a detective, but, you know, you get that. I went ahead and decided to go up to the hospital to try to decide if we could figure out who our victim was. I arrived at the hospital and I, went into the room and he was, lying on the hospital bed with gauze wrapped around his head. I could see where the bullet had entered his head. I could see he was on a ventilator. He was not responsive at all.
Meanwhile, news of the shooting and rumors about the victim's identity are spreading.
I was at my friend's house and someone called him and told him that Kobe had got shot. And at that moment, I was just calling Kobe, texting him like, hey, you good? I just heard you got shot. Like, what happened? Let me know. Where you at? Stuff like that. So I ended up calling my mama. Victoria told me that it was a shooting that happened at the balloon release where Kobe was at, and somebody told her that he had been grazed. Bullet grazed his ear. I pretty much was pacing around a little bit, trying to get my mind together. My child was just shot, So, first thing I could think of, I called my sister and told her what happened, and then I called 911.
The mother of the victim called into DeSoto and said, hey, I believe my son was the one that was shot at the park.
And so we had her come up to the hospital. That's one of the most difficult parts of my job, is being with, the loved ones and the friends of the victims and having to have them go into a hospital room and make an identification. Miss Graham did come in. She did identify the individual that was on the gurney as her son.
And that's when we started piecing together that this was, in fact, Colby Graham.
And I saw him. Laying in the bed, and he was hooked up to life support. It's hard to explain.
It really is. Like, somebody just punched me in my stomach when I saw him laying there. My heart just dropped to my stomach.
Colby Marquise Graham was born on January 6, 2001 in Dallas, Texas, one of 4 children.
He loved all his siblings. He played with them and he grew up with them. He was a real good kid. He liked to play, at the time, he liked to play football. He liked to play basketball, and he was a video game fanatic. He loved playing video games.
Me and Kobe used to do everything together, literally everything. Like, wherever I went, he went. You see him, you see me, you see him, you see me again. Like, yeah, so we was live.
In 2012, when Colby was in 6th grade, the family moved south of Dallas to the suburb of Lancaster.
He went to Lancaster High School, and then after Lancaster High School, he went to Gateway Charter School.
Colby and his brother took up boxing and found a new friend group.
The boxing community in Dallas, especially on the African-American side, is pretty small. It's predominantly like a Latin or Mexican atmosphere, so, you know, that draw the people closer, and the African-American kids get to know each other pretty fast.
He was very selective of the friends he hung around with, and the ones he hung around with I knew, and they was pretty good kids, very well-mannered. I met some of the parents that the kids he hung around with. They were really good kids.
Colby bonded with one young boxer in particular, Cameron Collier.
Cameron was really cool, really witty, easy to be around. I think boxing became an outlet for Cam and like an extended family and something to look forward to. So he worked really hard.
Cameron was a very gifted boxer, and he took it upon himself to study techniques of the greats, including Errol Spence Jr., a world champion and DeSoto native.
He was a rising star in the boxing community. He was also involved in the Marines, and he was very active in the community. You just take a lot of pride in that because you think this young man's really gonna grow up and be something.
Cameron and Kobe, they did a lot together. You know, he used to come to the house and pick him up when he needed to go places and did a lot together. They was friends for like maybe 4 to 5 years.
By 2021, the boyhood friends were now young men, and their friendship was as strong as ever. But that spring, tragedy struck.
On April 22nd, 2021, Kobe suffered a tremendous loss when his friend Cameron Collier was killed in his vehicle.
Colby was devastated.
He was so hurt, really hurt, like I just got through talking to him. He wasn't the Kobe he had used to be. You know, he had changed. I started noticing a lot of depression. He was kind of moping around the house and acting different.
3 days later, Colby planned to attend a balloon release in honor of his friend.
Cam died on a Thursday. Balloon release was on that Sunday. So within them days, he kind of made his mind up that he was gonna go. And originally, he wasn't gonna go by himself. He was gonna go with our cousin. Our cousin had something to do. He was just like, okay, cool, I'm just going by myself.
But hours later, Colby himself is the victim of a gunshot wound. He is on life support at a local hospital as his mother looks on in shock.
I looked at him, I'm like, wow, why? You know, it didn't make no sense to me. You know, seeing my son laying in that bed with those on that machine, like, it just didn't make sense. I didn't understand.
When we spoke with Colby's mom at the hospital, in my opinion, she was doing a really good job staying strong.
She was asking a lot of questions that I can remember, and I said, you know, we're working on it. I hugged her. I said, you know, we're gonna find out who did this.
Detectives working the case are familiar with Cameron's shooting 3 days earlier.
There were similarities between, you know, Cameron's death and now Colby Graham's.
Not only are the two cases similar, Colby's name had come up in Cameron's case.
He was a person of interest in Cam's murder. We immediately started to say, okay, this is definitely related to Cameron's homicide.
After sustaining a gunshot wound to the head at a memorial for his friend, 20-year-old Colby Graham clings to life in a Texas hospital.
Colby is in critical condition, and his chances of survival look slim.
The initial investigation was on what we call an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So that's what we initially started working the case as, but we knew there's a good chance that Mr. Graham would pass. The bullet that was removed from Colby's head was a .380 caliber.
.380, it's not a rare round, but more people lean towards 9mm 40, something more common. .380 is kind of, I wouldn't say rare, but it's not as common as a 9 or 40.
Most witnesses fled the scene of the balloon release in honor of 19-year-old Cameron Collier. That leaves DeSoto police with only one potential lead.
Colby Graham has been shot in the head just days after Cameron Collier.
He initially was a person of interest in the Cameron case.
Investigators revisit the details of the case.
When detectives responded to the scene of Cameron's homicide, it was a car that had actually looked like it had veered off of the road and was actually spun around backwards in somebody's front yard. And they found Cameron unresponsive in the driver's seat. And the thing about that scene was it was about to start raining, so we knew that preserving the evidence at that time was key. So we actually had people start fingerprinting the car almost immediately, and we actually did develop a palm print.
Detectives interviewed Cameron's family that same day.
We found out from the family that Cameron likes to sell shirts at this particular shopping center.
His mother was kind of having a hard time financially, so he was trying to help his mom out. He was selling these T-shirts, and people was buying them like it had his name. He was doing real well with the T-shirts. You know, he was making a lot of money with the T-shirts.
We immediately went and canvassed that shopping center.
Investigators pulled video from a nail salon. They saw a young man approach Cameron's parked car and strike up a conversation.
We actually see the individual actually getting into the passenger side of his vehicle and then leaving from that shopping center. We don't know what actually transpired in the car, what conversation took place in the car, but it was almost immediately after they left that shopping center, they made one right-hand turn and Cameron was dead. Minutes later, he was dead. So we believe that the person in this photo is responsible for Cameron's death. We took that still shot photo of that individual to the family, and we were showing them to everybody, asking, who is this person?
But no one recognized him.
Nobody could pinpoint who did it.
His family was eager for justice, especially Cameron's brother, Norman.
As we were talking to him, you could tell he was kind of hanging on every word we said, really taking in what we were telling him, trying to gather as much information as we were giving him at the time.
Even though Norm was older than Cam treated Norm like the younger brother. And Norm went wherever Cam was at, Norm came. Always, all the time. So, you know, like if you lose your brother like that, that's like taking a portion of yourself away. You know what I mean? You couldn't even imagine.
We said, let us do our job. Let us work through this investigation. We are working nonstop to catch Cameron's killer, and we will, for sure, do everything in our power to get somebody in custody if we have the right information. We asked the family, okay, who does Cameron usually hang around? Who can tell us where he has been, what his daily routine is? And they all said, well, yeah, he hangs out with Gabe. Him and Gabe are inseparable.
Gabe Salinas is also at the home.
We showed that image to Gabe. And Gabe was the one who initially implicated Colby as saying, that guy right there in the image, I'm 99% sure is Colby. That's when we started looking into Colby. We started trying to do some research on him.
Investigators spoke to Colby.
We look at, alibis. Where was Colby at the time? Everything that Colby was telling us was indicative that he was not anywhere near Cameron Collier's murder.
And we were kind of getting the sense that Colby, based on his height, was not the individual in this surveillance footage. You could tell that the person who got into Cameron's car was much shorter than Colby.
So we had eliminated him pretty quickly as a suspect.
That's when we actually found out that he had been killed at the vigil.
On the day of Colby's shooting, investigators circle back to Gabe Salinas.
And so we wanted to bring him in to see if he could help, right? We still hadn't made an arrest in the Cameron Collier death. So because Gabriel Salinas had told us that he had felt that Colby Graham had killed Cameron Collier, we wanted to dive in to get more information about why Gabriel thought that.
But now, Gabe has little to say.
Despite claims of knowing that Colby was responsible for shooting Cameron, Gabriel claims he did not know who shot Colby.
We weren't getting the whole picture, and we can kind of tell that.
Gabe does admit to being at the balloon release.
And so Gabe becomes a suspect, of course, because everybody who's present at the vigil is a suspect. Those that are closer to Cameron are more likely suspects.
Investigators in DeSoto, Texas, are trying to untangle the motive behind two shootings. One that claimed the life of Cameron Collier, and a second that left Colby Graham on life support.
The April 25th shooting of Colby Graham could have been carried out in retaliation for the murder of Cameron Collier.
Investigators question Cameron's friend Gabe, who initially pointed the finger at Colby as being responsible for Cameron's death.
We did want to look at Gabe's phone to see if there's anything in there that would indicate that he was involved in the murder on the 22nd or the murder of that day. I do a lot of digital forensics with cell phones and that sort of thing. So I asked Mr. Salinas if we could take his cell phone and do a forensic analysis of it. And he agreed. So as I was taking his phone to our lab to do it at the police department, a text came across from an individual named Norman. And the text came across as with a heart symbol and solid ass N-word. And at that point, based on my experience, that was somebody who was happy about something, that this was a good deed had happened, and so that concerned me.
Detectives recall that Cameron's brother's name is Norman, and they wonder if this text is from him.
I went into the contacts of Gabriel's phone and actually confirmed that it was Norman Collier's cell phone number that the text came from.
Investigators recall a detail from their interview with Norman following his brother's death.
So we had actually asked Cameron's family if he had any means of protection. Did he ever have a gun on himself to protect himself while doing these type of deals in the parking lots and stuff like that? And actually Norman said, yeah, he usually has my .380 on him as protection.
We knew Norman had access to a .380 handgun, a Glock, that he said him and his brother would carry from time to time. We knew the bullet that was removed from Colby's head was a .380 caliber.
When we pieced together that he had a .380, and we decided, okay, well, let's start looking into Norman. Obviously, we had the motive.
Norman and Cameron were very close. Norman was the older brother. Their father had passed away in 2012, and so they had grown up for a significant amount of time without their father.
We didn't want to go arrest Norman Collier unless we knew we were absolutely right. So we started putting surveillance on Norman. We started to do the other investigative things that we do. We started honing in on a real person of interest.
We started calling and say, hey, we need to talk to Norman. We started trying to get family members to help us talk with him. Once we kind of started leaning towards it being Norman, we found that it was harder and harder to actually get him in person.
On April 28th, investigators received new information about Cameron Collier's murder.
We were getting information from some neighbors that they may have captured an individual running across some yards on a couple doorbell cameras. When we got those videos, we saw that this individual was actually running to a certain particular house. He was wearing like a gray hoodie with some type of ripped jeans and I believe a red shirt underneath.
Then, investigators receive an ID on the palm print found in Cameron Collier's vehicle.
The lab comes back with an ID on the palm print. However, it doesn't belong to Kobe. The palm print comes back matching that of a 16-year-old with an extensive history of burglary named Justin Davis.
Based on some of the doorbell cameras, we saw that he ran specifically to this one house. And when we developed information, we learned that that house was actually the house of Justin Davis.
When police look up Justin Davis in the system, they see that he is wearing an ankle monitor connected to a different crime. But when they ping the monitor's location, they find that it's been disconnected or broken.
We did surveillance on his house. We went and spoke to his mother at their residence, searched the residence, looking for any kind of evidence. We couldn't locate Justin Davis.
Five days after the murder of Cameron Collier, investigators have identified a suspect, 16-year-old Justin Davis.
We couldn't locate Justin Davis, so we made the decision to do a directive to apprehend on a national database. In case he does get handled by any law enforcement officials, they'll know that we need to speak with him.
If Justin Davis killed Cameron, it proves that Colby didn't.
I remember talking to my partner at the time, Detective Acosta, and saying, did Norman get the wrong guy, right? Is this, I'm sure hoping not. We were hoping that this was not a case of Norman Collier going out trying to get revenge for the death of his brother Cameron.
But Norman's recent social media posts amp up their suspicions.
Norman Collier was posting things that were very interesting to law enforcement. Colby Graham was in a coma, and Norman is actually posting kind of derogatory things towards him being a zombie and that you're not dead, but you're not alive, those kind of things, indicating that, yeah, you're like the Walking Dead, essentially.
He made mockeries. He posted zombies. My brother was a zombie. I thought he was hard body, why they lied. Just all type of stuff, like crazy stuff. And it's like, boy, you just stay here and shot my brother and you making Instagram posts? Like, this what we doing?
It was him basically saying, that's what you get for messing with my brother, right? That's the way we took that post at that time.
Investigators are still unable to track Norman down for questioning. On April 28th, 3 days after Colby's shooting, investigators get another break.
We were actually told by another detective that he spoke to somebody from the Parks Department who happened to mention, hey, are you working that homicide that happened at the park? And he's like, well, there's video there. And we were shocked at that information. We immediately went over to the park and started extracting the video from the actual DVR. And when we brought it back, sure enough, it had captured the offense on camera.
When they watch it, they get a shock. They are able to clearly see footage of Kobe's shooter, and it's Norman Collier.
From what we can see on the video, we see that the vigil is going on. There's still people hanging around the park. Colby walks up kind of slow, and it almost seems like Norman was almost, in essence, stalking him, coming around a car, and as soon as they met close to each other in between two cars, he immediately pulled out a pistol from his left pocket, held it with his left hand, and fired a shot towards Colby in his head.
I remember the shock factor of Javier and I looking at each other as we recorded this. Murder on video, right?
After the shot rang out, people started to flee. They started getting cars, leaving. Not Norman.
Norman starts jumping around, obviously excited, obviously amped up, which is what we would see somebody who is, feel some sort of relief, right? That they have done something for lack of a better term, retaliation. You killed somebody close to me, now I'm gonna take your life.
We felt that he, in his heart of hearts, absolutely felt that he had killed his brother's killer.
That's when we swore out the arrest warrant for the aggravated assault.
But that charge is about to change. Colby's family gets a grim update on his condition.
It was the 28th. They took him down and they did the brainwave. And the doctor called me around about 8 in the morning and told me what was going on. He told me I need to get there. When we got into the room, they still had him hooked up to the machine. And the nurse kind of did a demonstration on him to show that he was gone. That's when they clarified that he was considered brain dead.
The next day, Colby Graham passes away.
I just heard my mama's footsteps walking in my room. She was just like, he didn't make it. And I was just like, damn. Like, I didn't know what to say. Even now, still in shambles, like, my heart is broken.
That's when we were planning on, changing the charge to capital murder under Texas law. Because when you commit murder in retaliation for something else, it rises up to the level of capital murder, which in Texas is punishable by life without parole in prison or the death penalty.
After a week of bloodshed leaves 2 friends dead, DeSoto police are on the lookout for 2 murder suspects. 16-year-old Justin Davis and 22-year-old Norman Collier. On April 29th, police get a tip on Norman's location.
We learned that Norman was actually staying with some family friends.
We called Norman and asked him to come to the police department to speak with us.
At first, it appears that Norman is ready to cooperate. Investigators come at Norman hard.
We told him, you shot the wrong guy. The individual that you shot was not the person who killed Cameron. We never revealed who it was. Based on Justin Davis's age at the time, we couldn't reveal that to him.
The news is a shock to Norman.
To be told that you killed the wrong person, you've risked your entire life and you've gotten it wrong. I think it was devastating.
He, in so many words, indicated that he was responsible for the death of Colby, but never outright said it. He said that he wanted to apologize to the families for what had happened. He would never fully outright say the words, yes, I shot Colby Graham, but the guilt was weighing on him so heavy that he was saying other things. He also stated what he did with the gun that he used. He told me that the gun, he had given it to somebody and that we would never find it.
Norman acknowledged that he got rid of the gun, but he didn't say to whom. And I think Norman's thinking there was he didn't want to get anybody else in trouble, that he was responsible for the shooting, and that the gun was gone.
Norman is officially charged with murder.
Once I learned that Norman Collier was in custody on the capital murder warrant, we drove over to the Collier's residence to let them know where Norman was and what had taken place. And I remember having the conversation with Mrs. Collier. It was very tough for me because I felt, here was a mother who had 2 sons. One had just been murdered a week before, and now we had just arrested her other son on a capital murder charge that, if it had been prosecuted as such, would have meant life in prison without parole or the death penalty. And to have to tell that to a mother who had been through so much affected me. I've never had to do that before, and I felt really bad for for Mrs. Collier having to go through that.
Even with the arrest, the investigation continues.
When we talked to Norman in his interview, he indicated that he had given the gun to somebody and that we were never going to find it. Right, so we believe that the only person that he had a close connection with after that shooting who would have been the one to give the gun to was Gabe.
Investigators bring Gabe Salinas back for another interview.
That's when Gabe learned that the wrong person had been shot. He was extremely torn up. You can tell that it was weighing very heavily on him that these certain events took place in this manner, and that he never said it directly, but we knew he was involved.
With neither Gabe nor Norman giving details, investigators piece together what they believe led to Colby's death. It started when investigators first showed Gabe still shots from surveillance on the day of Cameron's death.
Whenever we showed that picture to Gabe and he told us that it was Colby Graham, Norman was sitting on the sofa 10 feet from him when he heard that name, Colby Graham. And obviously there was conversations that were had once law enforcement left between Gabe and Norman as to maybe trying to devise a plan to get revenge.
Over those next 3 days, there was a lot of social media chatter in the DeSoto area. There were people saying that they knew had killed Cameron Collier. They knew that it was somebody who was close to him. We did see Colby Graham's name come up several times as people saying, oh, this is the man who killed, Cameron Collier.
Colby knew of the rumors and reached out to Gabe before the balloon release.
He felt that his name had been put out there as being involved in the homicide, which is why he clarified, hey, can I come? We believe Norman and Gabe may have actually rode to the balloon release together, and there was actually conversation had based on the cell phone extractions that we got that was telling Colby from Gabe, yeah, you can come through. So obviously that information would have been instantly relayed to Norm. As law enforcement, we believe he was lured to the scene to try to get him there. He knew in his heart of hearts that he had nothing to do with it, so maybe he felt, yes, I want to clarify things. My name is out there, but I didn't do this. I'm here for Cameron. I'm here to celebrate Cameron's life. And to him, that was more important than trying to squash any rumors. He was there to support Cameron, and unfortunately, he paid for it with his life.
As the dust settles around Colby's case, investigators still have an outstanding warrant to serve.
Justin Davis, who is responsible for the death of Cameron Collier, is still on the run.
In the weeks following the murder of Cameron Collier, authorities in DeSoto, Texas, search for his suspected murderer, 16-year-old Justin Davis.
We had known that he was being monitored by juvenile probation using an ankle monitor, that he had removed that ankle monitor.
Finally, on May 12th, Justin Davis is located in the Pleasant Grove area of Dallas.
Justin confesses to shooting Cameron Collier in a random act of violence.
For whatever reason, he found himself armed in the streets and looking to rob somebody. And he robbed and killed a person who didn't deserve it at all.
Justin Davis at the time of the offense was a juvenile, but was later prosecuted and certified as an adult in this case and was sentenced to an actual considerable length of time to prison.
In March 2024, Norman Collier goes on trial for the murder of Colby Graham.
He ended up pleading guilty to the jury at the beginning of trial. It's what we call a slow plea, which means you're going to a jury trial acting like you're going to plead not guilty. But when you go in, you stand up in front of the jury like, as a defense attorney, ladies and gentlemen, my client's guilty. He did what he's accused of doing. But there's a lot of mitigating factors that I want you to hear and why I'm going to ask you for a lot lesser sentence than what the state of Texas is offering as part of a plea bargain. And that's what happened in this case.
Norman entered a plea of guilty to the offense of murder. But in Texas, if a murder occurs under what's known as sudden passion, the range of punishment is reduced. And so the issue was whether or not this was a sudden passion murder.
Norman's attorney asserts that he is not a cold-blooded killer.
There was no evidence of him ever being convicted of any crime prior to this. And when I say any crime, I mean any crime. So Norman had zero experience with the criminal justice system. Norman played video games, frankly. He stayed in more than his brother, and he had worked some various odds and ends jobs and made contributions to his household, but he wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't somebody that I think if you passed on the street that you would feel any type of threat at all.
They argue that while at the memorial for his brother, Norman was overcome with grief and anger.
There was a release of the balloons that had occurred, and it's kind of the same thing that occurs when you're graveside at a funeral and you see a coffin lowered. Now, I think the emotions that you feel in that moment, there's a lot of finality to it. There's a lot of pain. And this was just several days after his brother's death. It's generally understood that the impact of death, particularly someone close to you, changes how you feel and act mentally.
But prosecutors point out that Norman Collier brought a gun to the memorial, suggesting premeditation.
They tried to say that he acted out of sudden passion. There's nothing sudden about it. Sudden is when you hear about it, you see it, you act upon it, whatever the case may be at that moment. You don't wait 3 to 4 days and then go with your move. That's not sudden.
It was already in his mind what he was gonna do to him. So, and he had the time to change his mind. He had the time. But he didn't.
Ultimately, the judge came to the decision to sentence Norman Collier to 22 years in prison.
I don't think Norman would have done what he did unless he actually believed that Colby had killed his brother. It's sad to me not only that he decided to take matters into his own hands, it's that he made a huge mistake and ended an innocent person's life for no reason.
It didn't make sense to me, and it was so sad because this young man, he lost his life too. And it was sad as well for him and his family. And him shooting my son was more so, he was hurting.
12 words. That was all it took to convince one man that his family had simply disappeared. A wife had packed up her belongings. 2 young children had followed their mother into the darkness before dawn. No struggle. No screams. No witnesses. Just a handwritten note left behind like the final page of a story that nobody had watched unfold. At first glance, it sounded almost ordinary. Marriages fail. People leave. Families break apart. But detectives standing inside the Rallo home would soon discover that ordinary stories rarely begin with silence this complete. Silence has a strange way of settling over places where the truth has been buried. It lingers in hallways. It clings to furniture. It fills every empty room with questions that refuse to disappear. In August 1976, one quiet house in Hamilton, Ontario, became exactly that kind of place. The answers hidden inside its walls would eventually reveal a crime that horrified an entire nation. Yet even after decades of investigations, court proceedings, and countless attempts to uncover every missing piece, one heartbreaking mystery would remain unsolved. One child would never come home. One family would never have the chance to bury everyone they had lost. And one man would carry the secret to his grave. When people think about infamous family murders, they often imagine scenes of overwhelming violence, shattered homes, and obvious evidence pointing directly toward the person responsible. The Rallo case was different. There was no dramatic emergency call in the middle of the night. No frightened neighbors reporting screams through thin walls. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. There was only a husband who calmly told police that his wife had decided to leave him, taking their son and daughter with her. It was a story that asked investigators to believe that a young mother had walked away from everything familiar without warning. But every experienced detective knows that stories are fragile. They either grow stronger under scrutiny, or they begin to collapse beneath the weight of simple questions. Long before the headlines reached newspapers across Canada, before courtrooms filled with reporters and grieving relatives, before jurors sat through weeks of testimony, there was simply a family trying to maintain the appearance of normal life. On the surface, nothing seemed especially unusual. A husband went to work. A wife cared for 2 young children. Their small home reflected the quiet routines shared by thousands of Canadian families during the mid-1970s. Children laughed. Meals were prepared. School schedules mattered. Weekends arrived and disappeared like they always did. From the outside, there was little reason to believe that anything extraordinary was waiting just beyond the front door. Yet appearances can be remarkably deceptive. The most dangerous fractures inside a family are often invisible to everyone standing outside. Smiles offered to neighbors can conceal months of arguments behind closed doors. Casual conversations can hide resentment that has been growing for years. Sometimes a marriage does not collapse in one explosive moment. Sometimes it erodes slowly, one disappointment at a time, until 2 people are living inside the same house while inhabiting completely different worlds. That quiet erosion would become one of the defining themes of the Rallo case. Investigators would later learn that beneath the ordinary routines existed a marriage under severe strain. John Rallo had become involved in an extramarital relationship. For Sandra, the discovery represented more than betrayal. It threatened the stability of the family she had worked to build. Relationships damaged by infidelity often become filled with uncertainty. Every conversation carries hidden meaning. Every silence feels heavier than the last. Trust, once broken, rarely returns unchanged. Nobody outside the marriage could fully understand what was said during their private conversations. Nobody could hear every disagreement or every attempt to repair what had already begun falling apart. Those moments belonged only to John and Sandra. What investigators could establish later was that the relationship had deteriorated significantly in the weeks leading up to the family's disappearance. That fact would become impossible to ignore once detectives started comparing John's version of events with the evidence emerging from the investigation. There is a haunting quality unique to family murder cases. Stranger homicides often begin with uncertainty because investigators must first identify the victim's final movements and possible enemies. Family cases are different. The people closest to the victim immediately become part of the investigation. The home itself becomes both sanctuary and suspected crime scene. Every photograph on the wall, every child's toy left on the floor, every untouched coffee cup begins telling its own quiet story. Detectives are forced to ask uncomfortable questions from the very beginning. Who was the last person to see the victims alive? Who benefits from their disappearance? Who had the opportunity to create a convincing explanation before anyone realized something was terribly wrong? Those questions would soon surround John Rallo. When officers first listened to his account, there was nothing immediately dramatic about it. According to him, Sandra had left with Jason and Stephanie sometime during the night or early morning hours. She had even left behind a note explaining her decision. On paper, the explanation seemed straightforward enough. Couples separate. Parents leave unhappy marriages. Children often accompany one parent during those difficult transitions. If the note reflected Sandra's genuine intentions, then perhaps this was not a criminal investigation at all. Perhaps it was simply the painful end of another troubled marriage. But investigators are trained to notice what does not fit as much as what does. Genuine disappearances usually leave behind messy realities. Family members contact relatives. Friends receive phone calls. Personal belongings vanish along with the missing person. Financial activity continues somewhere else. People rebuilding their lives leave traces because living requires movement. It requires decisions. It requires interaction with the world. Complete silence is surprisingly uncommon. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding Sandra's disappearance, that silence became increasingly difficult to explain. The note itself raised questions. John's timeline raised questions. The absence of convincing evidence supporting voluntary disappearance raised even more questions. Bit by bit, the simple story began showing cracks. Meanwhile, Sandra's family struggled with emotions that shifted between confusion and dread. Every passing day without contact chipped away at the hope that she had chosen to leave voluntarily. Those who knew her best found it increasingly difficult to accept the explanation. A mother devoted to her children does not usually vanish without reaching out to the people who love her. She does not erase herself from every familiar connection overnight. She does not simply disappear into nothingness. Days stretched into weeks. Hope slowly gave way to fear. Then fear gave way to something far worse. Investigators would eventually recover Sandra's body from the water. The discovery transformed the case instantly. No longer were detectives searching for a missing wife who might someday return home. They were investigating murder. Medical examination determined that Sandra had died by strangulation, a deeply personal form of homicide requiring direct physical force. Unlike crimes committed from a distance, strangulation places the killer within inches of the victim. It demands sustained pressure, sustained intent, sustained control. That single medical finding changed everything. Before the shock surrounding Sandra's death could fully settle, another devastating discovery followed. The body of 5-year-old Stephanie Rallo was also found in the water. Like her mother, she had been strangled. In that moment, the investigation crossed a line from tragedy into unimaginable horror. A young mother was dead. A little girl was dead. And 6-year-old Jason remained missing. The possibility that one child might still be alive became increasingly difficult to reconcile with everything investigators had uncovered. As searches continued, hope diminished with each passing day. Yet no matter how extensively authorities searched, Jason was never found. That absence would become the deepest wound left behind by the Rallo family murders. Decades would pass. Detectives would retire. Court records would gather dust inside archives. Seasons would continue changing across Hamilton year after year. But somewhere, the answer to Jason's final resting place remained hidden. For his surviving relatives, grief never reached its natural conclusion because there was no grave to visit, no place to leave flowers, no certainty that every question had finally been answered. Closure is a word often used after criminal trials, but for families of missing victims, closure is rarely complete. The missing continue to exist in a painful space between memory and uncertainty. As this investigation unfolded, police would uncover inconsistencies that gradually shifted suspicion toward the person who had first reported the family missing. What began as a disappearance would evolve into one of Canada's most haunting family murder cases, built not upon a confession, but upon a growing collection of evidence that pointed steadily in one direction. And as the investigation moved forward, every new discovery would raise a question even more chilling than the last. If the story told on that August morning was false, then what really happened inside the Rallo home before the sun came up? In the summer of 1976, Hamilton, Ontario, was a city built on routine. Long before dawn, the furnaces of its steel mills illuminated the sky with a dull orange glow that many residents barely noticed anymore. The sound of freight trains echoed through neighborhoods where generations of working families had built their lives. Mornings belonged to factory workers carrying lunch pails. Afternoons belonged to children riding bicycles along quiet residential streets. Evenings ended with porch lights flickering on one by one as another ordinary day slipped into memory. It was a city that valued stability. People knew their neighbors. Children played together until the streetlights came on. Front yards were carefully maintained, not because anyone expected praise, but because that was simply what families did. The rhythm of daily life felt dependable, almost comforting. News traveled quickly through neighborhoods, yet most conversations revolved around work schedules, school events, rising grocery prices, or weekend plans. Violent crime existed, as it did everywhere, but it rarely became the defining feature of an ordinary family living on an ordinary street. That was one reason the Rallo case would leave such a lasting scar. It challenged an assumption that many people quietly carried with them, that home was the safest place a person could be. The Rallo family appeared to fit comfortably into Hamilton's image of middle-class domestic life. John Rallo worked to support his family while Sandra devoted much of her time to raising their two young children, Jason and Stephanie. Their lives revolved around the familiar responsibilities shared by countless young parents. Bills had to be paid. Meals had to be prepared. Laundry accumulated faster than anyone wanted. Toys inevitably found their way across the living room floor before being gathered again each evening. Nothing about those routines suggested that history would remember their names. Family photographs captured moments that now carry an unbearable weight. Smiles frozen in time. Young faces untouched by the knowledge of what lay ahead. Looking at those images decades later, it becomes almost impossible not to search for invisible clues. Was there sadness hidden behind someone's expression? Did anyone already sense that the family was beginning to fracture? Photographs never answer questions like those. They preserve appearances. Reality often exists just beyond the edge of the frame. Neighbors later described the Rallos as a family that did not immediately attract attention. They were not known for constant public arguments or dramatic confrontations. From the outside, they blended into the neighborhood like everyone else. That ordinary appearance would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. Many of history's most disturbing family murders begin inside homes that looked perfectly normal from the sidewalk. Curtains were opened every morning. Cars sat in driveways. Children laughed in backyards. Life appeared to continue exactly as expected. Only the people living inside those walls understood the private struggles that outsiders could neither see nor imagine. Behind the front door of the Rallo home, the marriage between John and Sandra had entered a period of serious strain. Investigators would later establish that John had become involved in an extramarital relationship. Although the surviving records do not preserve every private conversation between husband and wife, they do show that the affair placed enormous pressure on their marriage. Trust, once damaged, rarely disappears all at once. It fades gradually, replaced by suspicion, disappointment, and painful uncertainty. For Sandra, the affair represented more than betrayal. It threatened the future she had built around her family. Like many young mothers, much of her identity revolved around her children. Jason was 6 years old. Stephanie was 5. They were still at an age when parents shaped almost every part of their world. School routines, bedtime stories, family dinners, weekend outings, these ordinary moments become the foundation of childhood memories. Children that young rarely understand the complexities of adult relationships. They notice changes without understanding their causes. A conversation stops when they enter the room. A smile disappears a little faster than it once did. Doors close more often. Silence lasts a little longer after dinner. Arguments become whispers behind bedroom walls. The atmosphere changes before anyone explains why. No public record can tell us exactly what Jason and Stephanie saw during those final weeks. It would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. But what is known is that the marriage between their parents had deteriorated significantly. Detectives would later view that deterioration as one of the central elements in understanding what eventually happened. Affairs often create two competing versions of the future. One partner struggles to preserve what already exists. The other begins imagining life somewhere else. Those opposing visions can become impossible to reconcile. By August 1976, that conflict appears to have reached a critical point. The evening of August 16 has become one of the most closely examined periods in the entire investigation. According to evidence later presented in court, John and Sandra argued that night after the children had gone to bed. The precise words exchanged between them have never been established. No recording exists. No witness stood inside the room. Everything that happened during those private hours vanished with the people who were present. Yet the fact that an argument occurred would later become significant. Marital conflict, by itself, proves nothing. Couples argue every day without violence. What investigators needed to determine was not whether an argument happened, but whether it formed part of a chain of events leading directly to murder. That distinction mattered enormously. Good investigators resist the temptation to build conclusions before evidence supports them. Every possibility must be examined. Every assumption challenged. Every explanation tested against the facts. At the beginning of the investigation, police did not possess those facts. They only possessed uncertainty. Morning arrived. One husband remained inside the house. His wife and 2 children were gone. And a handwritten note waited to explain everything. Looking back today, knowing how the story ultimately unfolded, it is tempting to imagine that detectives immediately recognized deception. Reality is usually less dramatic. Criminal investigations often begin with incomplete information and competing explanations. Officers must evaluate each possibility without allowing hindsight to distort their judgment. Initially, one explanation remained entirely possible. Sandra had left voluntarily. Marriages end. Parents separate. Children sometimes leave with one parent. If that had been true, the case would never have become part of Canadian criminal history. But truth rarely depends upon what seems possible. It depends upon evidence. As investigators slowly began examining the circumstances surrounding Sandra's disappearance, they encountered questions that refused to disappear. Why had she apparently left without maintaining contact with relatives? Why did aspects of the handwritten note seem unusual? Why did John's account require clarification more than once? None of those questions independently proved guilt. Together, however, they began forming a pattern. Patterns are among the most powerful tools available to homicide investigators. Individual facts can often be explained away. Multiple inconsistencies pointing in the same direction become much harder to ignore. Inside the Rallo home, detectives carefully documented everything they could observe. Homes preserve remarkable amounts of information for investigators trained to recognize it. The placement of everyday objects. Personal belongings left behind. Clothing still hanging inside closets. Children's possessions remaining exactly where they had been used. Every ordinary object carries extraordinary significance once a family suddenly disappears. An untouched favorite toy. A pair of children's shoes. Family photographs standing neatly on a shelf. Each item silently asks the same question. If someone truly intended to leave forever, why was so much of their life left behind? Those early observations did not immediately solve the case. Instead, they deepened the mystery. The disappearance no longer resembled the simple explanation first presented to police. Something felt incomplete. Something important was missing. For investigators, that feeling alone could never justify an arrest. Instinct opens doors. Evidence walks investigators through them. Over the coming weeks, the evidence would begin arriving in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. Water would surrender secrets that someone believed would remain hidden forever. A grieving family would learn that hope had transformed into mourning. And the quiet streets of Hamilton would discover that one ordinary household had concealed a tragedy almost beyond comprehension. The city itself continued moving forward, unaware that one investigation was about to become one of the most haunting family murder cases in Canadian history. Residents went to work. Children returned to school. Summer gradually yielded to autumn. Yet beneath that appearance of normal life, detectives were assembling fragments of a story that grew darker with every passing day. Before long, the focus would shift from a missing family to a homicide investigation, and every answer uncovered would reveal another question waiting beneath it. The home that had once symbolized family life would soon become the center of an investigation that would echo through Canadian true crime history for decades to come. Every homicide investigation begins with a question that seems almost too simple to ask. Who were they before they became victims? It is a question that often receives far less attention than the identity of the killer. Newspapers remember names because of crimes. Court records reduce entire lives to exhibits and testimony. Years later, when people revisit a case, they often remember the murderer more clearly than the people whose lives were taken. The Rallo family deserves to be remembered differently. Long before investigators collected evidence or attorneys presented arguments before a jury, Sandra Rallo was simply a young mother trying to build a life for her children. She was 29 years old. At an age when many people are still imagining the future they hope to create, Sandra was already living hers. She had a husband, a home, and 2 young children whose days revolved around her presence. The ordinary responsibilities of family life filled her schedule. There were meals to prepare, clothes to wash, children to comfort, routines to maintain. Like countless parents, much of her work happened quietly, unnoticed outside the walls of her home. History rarely celebrates those ordinary acts. Yet they form the foundation upon which childhood is built. Every packed lunch. Every bedtime routine. Every scraped knee cleaned and bandaged. Every reassuring smile after a frightening dream. These moments rarely appear in official records, but they are often what children remember most. That was the world Sandra occupied. Public records surrounding the Rallo case do not preserve extensive personal details about her hobbies, ambitions, or private thoughts. We do not know the books she enjoyed reading or the music she preferred. We do not know what she imagined her children would become as they grew older. Those intimate parts of her life disappeared alongside her, leaving only fragments that investigators and relatives could piece together afterward. Sometimes the greatest tragedy of violent crime is not only the life that ends, but the future that disappears with it. Every birthday never celebrated. Every family photograph never taken. Every ordinary afternoon that should have existed but never arrived. Those invisible losses never appear in court documents. Yet they are among the most devastating consequences of homicide. Sandra's life became increasingly complicated as her marriage deteriorated. Investigators would later establish that John Rallo had entered into an extramarital relationship. Affairs do more than damage trust. They alter the emotional landscape of an entire household. Conversations become cautious. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Even ordinary decisions begin carrying emotional weight. For couples with children, those tensions rarely remain confined to the adults involved. Young children notice changes long before they understand them. Parents often believe they are protecting their children by arguing behind closed doors or lowering their voices. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they do not. Children observe expressions. They recognize sadness. They sense distance. Even when they cannot explain what has changed, they know something has. Jason and Stephanie were still too young to understand the complexities of marriage. Whatever disagreements existed between their parents belonged to a world far beyond childhood. Their concerns were likely much simpler. What game would they play tomorrow? Would they be allowed to stay up a little later? Would someone read them another bedtime story? Children naturally assume tomorrow will resemble today. They trust that adults will keep the world stable. That trust is one of childhood's greatest gifts. Jason, at 6 years old, stood at the beginning of a lifetime of discoveries. Children that age live in constant motion. Every week brings something new to learn. Questions arrive faster than adults can answer them. Curiosity transforms ordinary walks into adventures. A stick becomes a sword. A cardboard box becomes a castle. An empty backyard becomes an entire universe limited only by imagination. Although surviving records reveal relatively little about Jason's personality, they tell us something more important. He was loved. His disappearance would haunt his extended family for nearly half a century. People do not spend decades searching for someone who was forgotten. They search because love refuses to accept uncertainty. That uncertainty would eventually become one of the defining tragedies of this case. Unlike many homicide investigations, the Rallo family murders would never provide complete answers. Jason's body has never been recovered. Without a grave, mourning becomes unusually complicated. Families often describe this experience as living with two contradictory emotions at the same time. One part of the heart understands the truth. Another part continues searching. Even decades later. Stephanie, only 5 years old, was even younger than her brother. 5-year-olds view the world with remarkable optimism. Tomorrow always feels exciting. Adults often underestimate how completely young children trust the people around them. Parents are protectors. Home is safety. Nighttime ends with familiar voices. Morning begins with familiar faces. That simple certainty shapes a child's understanding of the world. Looking back through the lens of this tragedy makes those ordinary realities almost unbearable. Stephanie never had the opportunity to grow beyond early childhood. She never experienced adolescence. Never graduated from school. Never chose a career. Never built a family of her own. Everything she might have become remained permanently unfinished. In many homicide cases involving children, investigators and prosecutors emphasize this reality because it illustrates the true magnitude of the loss. Murder does not merely end a life as it exists in one moment. It destroys every possible future attached to that life. The birthdays disappear. The friendships disappear. The dreams disappear. Entire decades vanish before they have the chance to begin. As the investigation progressed, detectives found themselves reconstructing not only the events surrounding the family's disappearance but also the relationships that defined daily life inside the Rallo household. Every witness added another small piece. Every interview expanded the picture. Friends, relatives, acquaintances. Each person described the family from a different perspective. No single conversation revealed the complete truth. Instead, investigators relied upon accumulation. One observation confirmed another. One inconsistency highlighted the next. That process requires patience. Real investigations rarely unfold the way they do in television dramas. Breakthroughs are uncommon. Most cases advance through dozens of small discoveries that gradually eliminate one explanation after another until only one remains. For detectives examining the Rallo case, understanding Sandra herself became essential. Would she willingly disappear without contacting those closest to her? Would she leave behind familiar relationships without explanation? Would she abandon the routines that centered around her children? Those questions would later influence how investigators interpreted the handwritten note reportedly left behind after the family's disappearance. If the note accurately reflected Sandra's intentions, then her actions should have matched its message. If her behavior did not match the story presented, investigators needed to understand why. This distinction became increasingly significant as the investigation continued. Those who knew Sandra struggled to reconcile the explanation offered by John with the woman they remembered. Human beings are creatures of habit. Major life decisions often leave recognizable patterns. People preparing to leave troubled relationships typically make plans. They confide in trusted relatives. They seek emotional support. They arrange practical necessities. Although every situation differs, complete and immediate silence often raises difficult questions. Those questions grew louder with every day Sandra failed to contact anyone. Meanwhile, concern spread through the family. Hope remained alive because hope almost always survives longer than logic. Missing person investigations are emotionally exhausting precisely because uncertainty creates endless possibilities. Perhaps she had gone somewhere unexpected. Perhaps she needed time alone. Perhaps she would return tomorrow. Tomorrow eventually became next week. Next week became another. Each passing day transformed optimism into fear. No family measures time quite the same way after someone disappears. Hours feel unusually long. Telephone calls become emotionally charged. Every knock at the door interrupts breathing for a moment. Every unfamiliar car slows the heart before disappointment quietly returns. Relatives begin living inside a constant cycle of expectation and uncertainty. That emotional burden affected everyone connected to Sandra and the children. While detectives worked methodically through evidence, relatives fought an entirely different battle against imagination. Imagination fills empty spaces with possibilities. Some comforting. Some terrifying. None certain. It is one of the cruelest aspects of disappearance. Death, painful as it is, eventually provides certainty. Disappearance prolongs suffering by denying it. As investigators continued assembling evidence, they remained committed to one central objective. Find the family. Determine what happened. Separate fact from assumption. Those goals guided every interview, every document reviewed, every lead pursued. At that stage, detectives could not yet know that the case would eventually become one of Canada's most haunting family murder investigations. Nor could they know that one member of the family would never be recovered. The people at the center of the investigation were still more than names inside police files. Sandra was still a daughter. Jason was still a little boy whose relatives desperately hoped to see again. Stephanie was still a child whose absence left an impossible silence behind. Before prosecutors, juries, or newspaper headlines would redefine them as victims, they were a family whose lives had become intertwined with a mystery growing darker by the day. The search continued, but beneath every new question lay an increasingly painful realization. If the explanation first offered to investigators was untrue, then somewhere between the final ordinary evening inside the Rallo home and the first light of the following morning, something irreversible had happened. And before detectives could identify the person responsible, they would first have to uncover exactly how an entire family's future had vanished in a single night. The precise sequence of events inside the Rallo home during the night of August 16, 1976, has never been fully reconstructed with certainty. What investigators were able to establish comes not from eyewitness accounts, but from a combination of circumstantial evidence, forensic findings, and statements provided during the early stages of the investigation. Even with those sources, several critical moments remain unclear, preserved only as inference rather than confirmed fact. What is known is that on the evening before the disappearance, John and Sandra Rallo were inside their home in Hamilton, Ontario, along with their 2 children, Jason and Stephanie. By this point in the investigation, it had already been established that the marriage was under significant strain, and that John Rallo was involved in an extramarital relationship. The exact nature of the final conversation between John and Sandra that night was never directly documented, as no recording or witness testimony exists for those private moments inside the residence. According to later statements and investigative reconstruction, the children were put to bed before any critical confrontation occurred. This detail became important because it places the adults alone together in the home during the time frame when the fatal events are believed to have taken place. However, the absence of direct evidence means that the exact timing, duration, and content of any argument between them cannot be confirmed with precision. The following morning, John Rallo reported that his wife and children were missing. He stated that Sandra had left the home with Jason and Stephanie during the night or early morning hours. He also indicated that a handwritten note had been left behind, suggesting that Sandra had chosen to leave voluntarily. This note became one of the earliest focal points of the investigation, as its authenticity and context were immediately subject to scrutiny by police. At the time of this initial report, there was no physical evidence presented publicly that confirmed a struggle inside the home. There were no immediate signs described in early records of forced entry or external intrusion. As a result, investigators initially had to consider multiple possibilities, including voluntary disappearance and family separation. However, this stage of the investigation was highly preliminary, and conclusions were not yet established. As police began to examine the circumstances more closely, inconsistencies emerged between John Rallo's account and the broader context of the case. These inconsistencies did not, on their own, prove criminal activity, but they contributed to growing skepticism about the explanation that Sandra had left voluntarily with the children. The handwritten note attributed to Sandra became a key piece of evidence. Investigators questioned its origin and whether it accurately reflected her intentions. While the content of the note was reportedly consistent with a voluntary departure narrative, its context and timing raised concerns, particularly when considered alongside other emerging findings in the case. Another central issue in the early investigation was the absence of any corroborating evidence that Sandra had made preparations consistent with leaving permanently. In cases of voluntary disappearance, it is common for individuals to make some form of financial, logistical, or social arrangements. In this case, investigators did not initially identify clear evidence of such preparations in the available records. As the investigation progressed beyond the initial report stage, the case changed fundamentally when Sandra Rallo's body was discovered in a body of water. The recovery of her remains shifted the classification of the case from missing persons to homicide investigation. Forensic examination determined that the cause of death was strangulation, indicating that Sandra had been killed through direct physical force rather than accidental or environmental causes. This finding was significant because it established that Sandra did not leave the home voluntarily in the manner described in the initial account provided by John Rallo. Instead, it confirmed that she had been the victim of a violent homicide. The location and condition of the body also suggested post-mortem disposal in water, although the exact circumstances of how and when this occurred remain part of the investigative record rather than fully reconstructed fact. Following the discovery of Sandra's body, the investigation intensified. Authorities began treating the case as a criminal matter involving potential family-related homicide. Shortly thereafter, the body of 5-year-old Stephanie Rallo was also recovered. The cause of death in her case was likewise determined to be strangulation. This second discovery confirmed that more than one member of the family had been killed. At this point, attention shifted significantly toward the whereabouts of 6-year-old Jason Rallo, who had not been located. Despite extensive search efforts documented by investigators, Jason's body was never recovered. This absence became one of the defining unresolved elements of the case. Based on the evidence of the deaths of Sandra and Stephanie, investigators concluded that Jason was also likely deceased, although this conclusion was based on inference rather than physical recovery. The transition from missing persons case to double homicide, and later to presumed triple homicide, fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. John Rallo's initial account, in which Sandra had left with the children, was no longer consistent with the forensic evidence that had been uncovered. At this stage, investigators began re-evaluating earlier statements, timelines, and physical evidence from the residents. The handwritten note, the timeline of events, and the absence of corroborating signs of voluntary departure were all reassessed in light of the confirmed homicides. However, it is important to note that the specific mechanics of what occurred inside the home during the critical hours remain partially unknown. The sequence of actions, the exact time of death, and the precise circumstances leading to each fatality were not fully reconstructible from the available evidence presented in public records. What can be stated with certainty is limited to 3 core facts established through investigation and forensic analysis. Sandra Rallo was killed by strangulation. Stephanie Rallo was also killed by strangulation. Jason Rallo was never found and is presumed to have been killed in connection with the same events, although his remains were not recovered. Everything beyond those facts belongs to the interpretive layer of the investigation, which would later be examined in court during the prosecution phase of the case. With the recovery of Sandra Rallo's body and later Stephanie Rallo's body, the case rapidly transitioned from a missing persons inquiry into a homicide investigation. What had initially been treated as a potential voluntary disappearance was no longer plausible in the face of forensic evidence confirming strangulation in both deaths. The focus of investigators shifted immediately to understanding who had the opportunity, motive, and means to commit the crimes inside the family home. At the center of that focus stood John Rallo, the only adult who reported the disappearance and the last known person confirmed to have been present in the household during the relevant time frame. From an investigative standpoint, this placed him in a position of primary interest, not because of assumption, but because of proximity to the events under examination. One of the earliest issues identified by investigators was the inconsistency between John Rallo's initial account and the physical evidence recovered. His statement described Sandra leaving the home voluntarily with the children, supported by a handwritten note attributed to her. However, once the bodies of Sandra and Stephanie were recovered, this narrative could no longer align with established forensic findings. The note, which had initially served as the foundation of the disappearance explanation, became instead a critical piece of questioned evidence. Investigators also noted that aspects of John Rallo's timeline required clarification. During early interviews, certain details of his account were revisited or adjusted as the investigation progressed. While changes in recollection can occur under stress, repeated inconsistencies drew increased scrutiny from law enforcement, particularly when considered alongside the absence of any corroborating evidence supporting voluntary departure by Sandra. Another key factor in the investigation was motive. Evidence presented during the broader case established that John Rallo was involved in an extramarital relationship, and that the marriage between him and Sandra was under significant strain. While marital conflict alone is not evidence of criminal behavior, it was considered relevant in establishing context for potential interpersonal violence within the household. Investigators examined whether there were any signs that Sandra had planned to leave the home independently. In cases of voluntary disappearance, individuals often make some form of preparation, whether financial arrangements, communication with relatives, or logistical planning. In this case, investigators did not identify clear evidence of such preparation at the time of the initial investigation, which further complicated the plausibility of the voluntary departure scenario. As the investigation deepened, attention also turned to the physical environment of the home. Although early public records do not describe overt signs of forced entry or external intrusion, the absence of such evidence reinforced the working hypothesis that the events occurred inside the residence and involved individuals already present at the scene. Despite these developments, the investigation did not immediately result in a confession or direct eyewitness account. Instead, the case evolved primarily through circumstantial evidence, forensic conclusions, and the elimination of alternative explanations. This type of evidentiary structure is not uncommon in domestic homicide cases, where crimes occur in private spaces without external witnesses. Detectives also pursued additional lines of inquiry beyond John Rallo, as standard procedure requires consideration of all possible suspects. However, no alternative suspect emerged with a credible connection to the victims, access to the residence, or a motive supported by evidence. As a result, investigative focus remained concentrated on the internal dynamics of the family. The unresolved disappearance of Jason Rallo added further complexity to the case. With no recovery of his remains, investigators were unable to apply the same forensic conclusions used in the deaths of Sandra and Stephanie. Nevertheless, based on the established pattern of events and the absence of evidence suggesting his survival or relocation, authorities concluded that Jason was likely also deceased. The lack of recovery, however, left a permanent gap in the physical record of the case. Over time, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies in the initial account, and forensic findings converged to form the foundation of the prosecution's theory of the case. This theory would later be tested in court, where the defense would challenge both interpretation and inference, and where the absence of direct eyewitness testimony would become a central point of legal contention. At this stage of the investigation, however, law enforcement had reached a critical conclusion. The explanation provided at the time of the disappearance did not align with the physical evidence. What remained was the task of proving, beyond reasonable doubt, how and why 3 members of the same family had come to harm inside their own home, while one child remained missing without a trace. By the time the investigation reached its most critical phase, the case of the Rallo family was no longer defined by uncertainty alone, but by accumulation. Each new piece of evidence did not exist in isolation. Instead, it added weight to a growing framework of inconsistencies that investigators were attempting to reconcile. The disappearance narrative, initially presented as a voluntary departure, had already been dismantled by forensic findings. What remained was the far more difficult task of constructing a coherent sequence of events from partial, indirect, and sometimes contradictory evidence. The turning point in the investigation did not come in the form of a single dramatic revelation. There was no sudden confession, no eyewitness stepping forward, no unexpected discovery of a hidden crime scene. Instead, the shift occurred gradually, as investigators re-evaluated the totality of the evidence and compared it against the initial explanation provided by John Rallo. The discovery of Sandra Rallo's body marked the first irreversible fracture in the original account. Her death by strangulation eliminated the possibility that she had left the home voluntarily in the manner described in the handwritten note. Once that fact was established, every element of the initial narrative had to be reassessed under a new framework. The note, the timeline, and the reported departure of the children were no longer neutral details, they became evidentiary components requiring explanation within a homicide context. The subsequent recovery of Stephanie Rallo's body reinforced this shift. With 2 confirmed homicides involving close family members, investigators now faced a pattern that suggested an internal domestic event rather than an external disappearance. The consistency in cause of death between Sandra and Stephanie further narrowed the range of plausible scenarios under consideration. At this stage, investigative focus intensified on the timeline of the evening of August 16, 1976, and the early hours that followed. Statements provided by John Rallo were carefully reviewed, compared, and re-examined for internal consistency. Investigators identified areas where his recollection required clarification or appeared to shift between interviews. While such variations can occur in stressful circumstances, in a homicide investigation they are assessed alongside all other available evidence. The handwritten note attributed to Sandra remained a central point of analysis. Investigators scrutinized its context within the broader evidentiary picture, particularly in relation to Sandra's established status as a homicide victim. The existence of the note alone did not provide confirmation of authorship or intent, and its role in the initial disappearance narrative became increasingly problematic once the physical evidence contradicted the idea of voluntary departure. Another significant development in the investigative process was the absence of corroborating evidence supporting the departure scenario. No independent witness accounts confirmed Sandra leaving the residence with the children. No financial or logistical trail consistent with planned relocation was identified in the early stages of the inquiry. While absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in a strict legal sense, in cumulative investigative reasoning it contributed to the narrowing of viable explanations. As these elements were synthesized, investigators began to construct an alternative theory of events based on the available facts. This theory centered on the premise that the homicides occurred within the family home during the time frame when John Rallo was present and when Sandra and the children were last confirmed to be alive. The exact sequence of actions remained undetermined, but the convergence of forensic and circumstantial evidence supported the conclusion that the events were domestic in origin. The investigation also re-examined the physical condition of the residence and any potential indications of struggle or disturbance. While early reports did not publicly detail extensive forensic findings at the scene, the absence of evidence suggesting external intrusion further supported the internal focus of the investigation. In cases where victims are found after being transported from a primary location, investigators must distinguish between the site of death and the site of recovery. In this case, the working assumption became that the home itself was the primary location of the fatal events. Despite the strengthening of the circumstantial case, investigators still faced a critical evidentiary challenge: the absence of direct eyewitness testimony or a confession. The case relied heavily on inference drawn from physical evidence, timeline reconstruction, and inconsistencies in the initial narrative. This type of evidentiary structure, while common in domestic homicide cases, requires careful presentation in court to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The disappearance of Jason Rallo remained the most unresolved element of the investigation. Unlike Sandra and Stephanie, whose bodies were recovered and whose causes of death were confirmed, Jason's fate was inferred from the surrounding evidence rather than directly established. His absence introduced a persistent gap in the evidentiary record, one that would later become a significant emotional and legal factor in the case. By the time the investigation reached the threshold of prosecution, the original explanation of a voluntary departure had been fully displaced by a theory of internal homicide supported by forensic findings and investigative reconstruction. The case no longer centered on locating missing persons, but on establishing responsibility for confirmed deaths and accounting for a missing child whose fate remained unverified. The breakthrough in this case, therefore, was not a singular moment of discovery. It was the gradual collapse of an alternative narrative under the weight of accumulated evidence, replaced by a prosecutorial framework that sought to explain how and why the events inside the Rallo household resulted in the deaths of Sandra and Stephanie, and the disappearance of Jason. What remained was the transition from investigation to courtroom, where these conclusions would be tested under legal scrutiny for the first time. By the time the Rallo case reached the courtroom in 1977, the investigation had already transformed from a missing persons report into a full homicide prosecution. What remained was no longer a search for answers in the field, but a confrontation between two competing interpretations of the same facts, one presented by the Crown, built on circumstantial evidence and forensic findings, and one presented by the defense, challenging the certainty with which those same facts could be interpreted. The Crown's case was structured around a central proposition, that Sandra Rallo and her two children did not leave their home voluntarily on the night of August 16, 1976, but were instead killed inside the residence, and that John Rallo was responsible for those deaths. This theory relied heavily on the established medical findings of strangulation in the deaths of Sandra and Stephanie, the absence of any credible evidence supporting voluntary departure, and the inconsistencies identified in John Rallo's initial account to police. A key element of the prosecution's argument was the timeline. The Crown presented evidence suggesting that John Rallo was the only adult confirmed to have been present in the home during the critical period in which the victims were last seen alive. While no eyewitness directly observed the events inside the house, the reconstruction of movements and statements placed responsibility within a very narrow frame of opportunity. The handwritten note attributed to Sandra became a point of significant contention during the proceedings. The Crown argued that the note did not align with the forensic reality of the case and should not be interpreted as evidence of voluntary disappearance. Instead, it was presented as part of a broader attempt to construct an alternative explanation for the absence of the victims. The defense, however, challenged this interpretation, arguing that the existence of the note introduced reasonable doubt regarding the sequence of events. John Rallo maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He did not provide a confession, and his defense team emphasized the absence of direct physical evidence linking him conclusively to the act of murder. In cases relying primarily on circumstantial evidence, the defense strategy often focuses on highlighting gaps in the prosecution's narrative, and this case was no exception. The argument centered on the principle that suspicion, even when strong, does not equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The disappearance of Jason Rallo remained one of the most emotionally and legally significant aspects of the trial. Unlike his mother and sister, Jason's body was never recovered, and therefore no direct forensic conclusion could be presented regarding his cause of death. The Crown argued that his disappearance, in the context of the confirmed deaths of the other two family members, strongly supported the conclusion that he too had been killed. The defense, however, pointed to the lack of physical recovery as a critical gap in the prosecution's case, emphasizing that assumption could not replace evidence. Throughout the trial, the courtroom became a space where two different narratives of the same family were placed under scrutiny. One narrative described a domestic environment that deteriorated into violence, ending in the deaths of a mother and two young children. The other challenged the certainty of that reconstruction, arguing that the evidence, while troubling, did not eliminate all reasonable alternative explanations. Witness testimony and investigative findings were presented in detail, with the court examining the sequence of events leading from the initial disappearance report to the recovery of the bodies. The jury was required to assess not only individual pieces of evidence, but the coherence of the entire narrative constructed by the prosecution. As is often the case in circumstantial prosecutions, the question before the jury was not whether every detail had been explained, but whether the totality of the evidence pointed beyond reasonable doubt in a single direction. The absence of direct eyewitness testimony meant that the case depended heavily on inference, consistency, and the elimination of competing explanations. After hearing the evidence and arguments presented by both sides, the jury ultimately returned a verdict of guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, relating to Sandra Rallo, Stephanie Rallo, and the presumed death of Jason Rallo. The verdict reflected the jury's acceptance of the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence, despite the lack of direct confession or complete recovery of all victims. Following the conviction, John Rallo was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum parole ineligibility period consistent with Canadian law at the time, requiring at least 25 years before eligibility for parole consideration. The sentence reflected the severity of the crimes as determined by the court and marked the formal conclusion of the trial phase of the case. However, while the legal process reached a definitive outcome, the case itself did not fully close in the emotional or investigative sense. The absence of Jason Rallo's remains left a permanent unresolved element within the story, one that no verdict could fully address. For the family of the victims, the court's decision provided legal recognition of what had happened, but it did not restore what had been lost, nor did it answer every remaining question. The courtroom delivered judgment, but it did not deliver completeness. After the trial ended and the sentence was delivered, the case of the Rallo family did not simply fade into history. Legally, it had reached its conclusion. Emotionally, it remained unfinished for everyone connected to it. Some cases end with resolution. Others end with a verdict. The Rallo family murders belonged firmly to the second category. John Rallo entered prison with a conviction for the murders of his wife, Sandra Rallo, and 2 children, Stephanie Rallo and the presumed death of Jason Rallo. The court had accepted the prosecution's interpretation of events, but acceptance in a courtroom does not erase uncertainty in the minds of those left behind. The absence of direct confession, combined with the disappearance of Jason's remains, meant that a portion of the story remained permanently open-ended. For Sandra's family, the years that followed were defined by a form of grief that did not follow a natural structure. In most cases of homicide, families eventually reach a place where they can visit a grave, mark a date, and acknowledge a final resting place. In this case, that process was incomplete. 2 members of the family were recovered. 1 was not. Jason Rallo remained missing, and that absence created a wound that no legal outcome could fully close. The passage of time did not soften the central unanswered question, where was Jason? That question persisted through decades of parole eligibility hearings, media retrospectives, and renewed public interest in the case. Each time the story resurfaced, the same fact remained unchanged. John Rallo consistently maintained his innocence and did not provide information that would lead to the recovery of Jason's remains. For investigators and family members, this silence became one of the most enduring and painful aspects of the case. As the years passed, the legal system continued to evaluate John Rallo's eligibility for parole under Canadian law. After serving the required minimum period, he eventually became eligible for review. In 2021, he was granted full parole. This decision reflected assessments of his behavior within the correctional system and the legal standards governing parole eligibility at the time. However, it did not resolve the emotional consequences of the original crime, nor did it answer the unresolved question of Jason's location. Even after his release, the central mystery of the case remained unchanged. The whereabouts of Jason Rallo had never been established, and no new verified information emerged to clarify his fate. For the public, the case had already become part of Canada's broader history of unresolved family tragedies, remembered not only for what was proven in court, but also for what remained unknowable. In May 2025, John Rallo died. With his death came the final closure of any possibility that he might provide further information regarding Jason's remains. Legally, the case was closed long before that moment. Practically, however, his death marked the end of any remaining investigative pathway that depended on his testimony. The unanswered question, once tied to a living individual who could potentially speak, now became a permanent historical absence. What remains today is a case defined by 2 certainties and 1 enduring uncertainty. The deaths of Sandra Rallo and Stephanie Rallo were established through investigation, forensic evidence, and court proceedings. The disappearance and presumed death of Jason Rallo were accepted by the court but never physically resolved. His body was never recovered, and no definitive explanation for its location was ever confirmed. For those who study criminal investigations, the Rallo case is often remembered not only for its outcome, but for what it leaves behind. It demonstrates how a case can move through every stage of the justice system, from initial report to final conviction, and still fail to resolve every human question at its core. Justice, in its legal form, was delivered. But resolution, in its emotional form, was not. Some cases end with answers. Some end with silence that never fully breaks. The Rallo family murders remain in that second category, where the final page of the official record does not completely close the story, and where one absence continues to define everything that came after. Some cases do not end when the verdict is read. They do not end when the sentence is served. And they do not end even when the person responsible is no longer alive to answer for them. The Rallo family murders belong to that category of stories that refuse to fully settle. In legal terms, the case reached its conclusion decades ago. The court examined the evidence, weighed the arguments, and delivered its judgment. But the courtroom is not the same as memory. It is not the same as grief. And it is not the same as the unanswered questions that remain in the lives of those left behind. Sandra Rallo is remembered through fragments: a mother, a daughter, a life interrupted at 29. Stephanie Rallo remains frozen forever at 5 years old, her life preserved only in what she never had the chance to become. Jason Rallo exists in a different, more painful category, not only lost, but never found, his absence becoming the most enduring silence in the entire case. In many ways, the story is not defined only by what was proven, but by what was never recovered. Time has passed. Court files have closed. Headlines have faded. The legal system has completed its work. But for the family, and for anyone who encounters this case years later, one question continues to echo without resolution. Where is Jason? There are cases where justice provides closure. And there are cases where justice can only define responsibility, not restore what was taken. This is one of those cases. And in that space between certainty and absence, the Rallo family remains remembered not only for how their story ended, but for the questions that still remain when everything else has already been said. There are cases you cover because they are shocking. There are cases you study because they are complex. And then there are cases like this one, where neither explanation nor silence feels complete enough to carry the weight of what happened. The Rallo family story does not end in a way that satisfies curiosity. It ends in a way that leaves you sitting with discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes from knowing that a courtroom can decide guilt, but it cannot always return certainty about every detail of what happened inside a single home on a single night. 3 lives were lost. 1 child was never found. And even decades later, the absence of that final answer continues to define everything else around it. Some cases are remembered for the evidence. Others are remembered for the verdict. But a few remain in memory for something harder to define. Not what we know, but what we will never fully know. Before the story ends, there is always a quiet moment that remains. Not in the courtroom, not in the headlines, but in the silence that follows. The Rallo family case is no longer active in the eyes of the law. It exists now in records, archives, and memory. But for those who encounter it again years later, it does not feel like something that is finished. It feels like something that has simply stopped speaking. Sandra Rallo is remembered in fragments of a life that was cut short. Stephanie Rallo remains forever a child in every retelling of this case. And Jason Rallo, more than any other figure in this story, represents the absence that no verdict was ever able to resolve. Some cases are defined by what was proven. Others are defined by what was lost. But a few remain defined by what was never found. And in those cases, even time does not feel like closure. It only feels like distance. There are cases that close neatly on paper, but never truly close in the human mind. The Rallo family murders are one of those cases where the official record ends long before the emotional weight of the story does. Legally, everything has been decided. The investigation was conducted. The evidence was presented. A jury reached its conclusion. A sentence was served. And over time, even the man at the center of the case eventually left the world behind. But none of those milestones erase the central fracture in the story. Because what remains is not just a historical case file. It is 3 lives that were interrupted inside a family home, and 1 absence that has never been resolved. Sandra Rallo is remembered through the lens of what was taken from her. A woman in her 20s, a mother raising 2 young children, a life defined by responsibilities that never made it into headlines but shaped every single day she lived. Her story does not end in the way it should have. It ends in interruption, and that interruption becomes permanent. Stephanie Rallo, only 5 years old, exists in memory as a child who never had the chance to grow beyond early childhood. Her entire identity is frozen in a stage of life where everything is still beginning. In cases like this, time does not continue for the victim. It stops completely, while the world around them keeps moving forward. And then there is Jason. 6 years old at the time of his disappearance. Unlike the others, his story does not even have the closure of recovery. There is no confirmed resting place, no physical point where grief can anchor itself. Instead, there is only absence. And absence has a way of becoming louder over time, not quieter. For the family left behind, that absence becomes something heavier than grief. It becomes uncertainty that never matures into acceptance. Because acceptance requires an ending, and Jason's story does not offer one. Even decades later, the central question of this case does not change. It does not become less important with time. It does not fade into background detail. It remains fixed in place, untouched by years, trials, or conclusions. Where is Jason? That question exists outside the courtroom. It exists outside the legal system. It exists in a space where evidence cannot fully reach, because it is not only a question of fact, but a question of finality. In true crime, there is often an assumption that resolution comes when responsibility is assigned. When a verdict is delivered, when a sentence is served, when a case is closed in the eyes of the law, it is easy to believe that the story has reached its natural endpoint. But human stories do not always follow legal structure. A verdict can establish accountability, but it cannot restore presence. It cannot reverse absence. It cannot rebuild the timeline of a life that was interrupted. And it cannot, in cases like this, recover what was never found. Time has passed since the events of 1976. Entire generations have grown up in a world where this case exists only as history. The names remain in archives, in articles, in recollections of past investigations. But for those directly connected to the loss, the passage of time does not transform the story into something finished. It only changes the distance between the present and the moment everything changed. Some cases become part of criminal history because of how they were solved. Others remain because of what was never fully answered. The Rallo family murders belong to the second category. They are remembered not only for what was proven, but for what could never be completely resolved in a physical sense. One child was never recovered. One part of the story remains permanently missing from the record. And that missing piece reshapes everything else around it. Because in the end, the most haunting part of this case is not what was discovered. It is what remains undiscovered. And that is where the story ultimately rests. Not in resolution, but in silence that never fully closes. Every case has a beginning. Some have an ending. But a few only have what was left behind. The Rallo family story is not remembered because it was solved. It is remembered because, even after every legal process reached its conclusion, something essential never returned to its place. Sandra never came home. Stephanie never grew up. And Jason was never found. The court decided what it could decide. Time did what time always does. But neither of them could answer the question that still lingers beneath everything else. Not who was responsible. That part, the system addressed. The question that remains is simpler. And somehow, heavier. Where is the child who never came back? Some stories are measured in facts. Others are measured in what facts cannot reach. And this one is measured in absence. Not everything that ends is finished. And not everything that is finished ever truly ends. There are cases in true crime that end with clarity. The facts are established, the timeline is reconstructed, and even if the outcome is tragic, there is still a sense that the story has reached its final shape. Everything fits into place, even if what it reveals is painful. And then there are cases like this one, where the shape of the story is clear in court, but never fully complete in the human mind. The Rallo family murders belong to that second category. On paper, the case is closed. The investigation reached its conclusion decades ago. A court heard the evidence, weighed the arguments, and delivered its verdict. A sentence was imposed, and eventually served. Even the passage of time itself has done what it always does. It moved forward, indifferent to what it left behind. But closure in law is not the same as closure in memory. Because memory does not operate like a courtroom. It does not accept verdicts as endings. It continues asking questions long after the file has been stamped and archived. Sandra Rallo remains, in historical record, a young mother whose life ended violently inside her own home. Her story is not defined by who she was in life alone, but by the abrupt interruption of everything she was still in the middle of becoming. At 29 years old, she was not a completed narrative. She was still in motion, still building a life around her children, still existing in the everyday rhythm of family responsibilities that never make it into official summaries of a case. Stephanie Rallo remains forever 5 years old. In a way that is difficult to fully comprehend, her entire existence is preserved at the very beginning of life. There is no adulthood to reflect back on, no later years to reinterpret, no future to revise the past. Her identity exists only in the most fragile stage of human development, where everything is still forming and nothing has yet been decided. And then there is Jason. 6 years old. Unlike the others, his story does not even have the finality of recovery. There is no confirmed resting place, no physical certainty that allows grief to settle into something defined. Instead, there is only absence. And absence is not a neutral condition. It changes shape over time. It becomes heavier in some moments, sharper in others, and in quiet moments it becomes almost unbearable in its simplicity. Because absence does not explain itself. It only persists. For the family left behind, that absence becomes something that does not behave like traditional grief. Grief usually has a direction. It moves from shock toward acceptance, from confusion toward understanding. But when a person is never recovered, that movement is disrupted. The mind cannot fully complete the emotional process because there is no final point to anchor it. So instead, the story remains open. Not in the legal sense, but in the human one. Even decades later, the central question of this case does not evolve. It does not fade. It does not resolve itself through time or distance. It remains exactly where it has always been, unchanged by the years that pass over it. Where is Jason? It is a question that exists outside the structure of court decisions, outside the boundaries of forensic conclusions, outside the finality of legal language. Because law requires evidence that can be confirmed, but human loss often exists in spaces where evidence is incomplete or permanently inaccessible. This is where the Rallo case becomes more than just a record of events. It becomes an example of the limits of resolution itself. A case can be proven. Responsibility can be assigned. A sentence can be served. But none of those outcomes can reconstruct what has physically disappeared without trace. Time continues forward, as it always does. The world changes. New cases emerge. New stories replace old headlines. The attention of the public moves on. Even official records settle into silence. But for those who return to this case, whether through research, memory, or curiosity, there is always the same final realization waiting at the end. That some stories do not resolve in the way we expect them to. Not because they lack answers entirely, but because they do not return everything that was taken from them. Sandra's life was interrupted. Stephanie's life was ended before it could begin. And Jason's life was removed from the record in a way that never allowed it to be fully accounted for in physical form. And that is why this case continues to exist in a different category from many others. It is not remembered only for what happened. It is remembered for what did not come back. And in the end, that is where the story rests. Not in explanation. Not in conclusion. But in the space where something is still missing, and time has never been able to fill it. Because some stories do not end when they are solved. They end only when nothing is left to search for. And even then, sometimes they still don't feel finished. There are cases in true crime that are remembered for how they were solved. Others are remembered for how they were investigated. But a rare few are remembered for something far more unsettling. They are remembered for how they refuse to feel finished. The Rallo family murders belong to that category. On a surface level, the story has a beginning and an ending. A family was living inside a home in Hamilton, Ontario. Something happened behind closed doors. The aftermath revealed tragedy, investigation, courtroom proceedings, and a final legal judgment. Time moved forward, as it always does, and the system eventually reached its conclusion. But stories like this do not end where the paperwork ends. They continue in a different form. Sandra Rallo's life ended at 29. Stephanie Rallo's life ended at 5. And Jason Rallo's life ended in a way that never allowed the world to confirm where it stopped. One body was never recovered. One resting place was never identified. One part of the story was never returned to the earth in a way that allows closure to exist in a physical sense. That is what separates this case from many others. Not just the violence, but the absence that followed it. Because absence behaves differently than loss. Loss can be acknowledged. It can be marked. It can be visited. But absence continues to exist without form, without location, and without an ending that the human mind can properly process. Years passed. Then decades. The courtroom completed its work. The legal system closed its files. Even public attention eventually shifted elsewhere. Yet none of those things addressed the most persistent question at the center of everything. Not what happened in a legal sense, but what remains missing in a physical sense. Where is Jason? That question does not belong to the courtroom anymore. It does not belong to investigators or legal records or historical summaries. It belongs to the space between what is known and what will never be confirmed. And that is where this case continues to exist. In that space, there is no final chapter. No definitive resolution that allows the mind to rest completely. Only the understanding that some parts of a story can be explained, while others remain permanently out of reach. Time does not erase that kind of uncertainty. It only moves around it. And so the Rallo family remains, not as a concluded narrative, but as something more fragile and more haunting. A reminder that justice can be delivered. But completeness cannot always be restored. And in the end, what remains is not a verdict. Not a sentence. Not even a history. What remains is the silence of one unanswered question that time has never been able to fill. And that silence is the final shape of this story. There are cases in true crime that feel like they belong to a beginning and an end. A clear timeline, a defined investigation, a courtroom where facts are weighed, and a verdict that brings structure to chaos. In those cases, even when the outcome is tragic, there is still something the human mind can hold on to. A sense that, in some form, the story has reached its final shape. The Rallo family murders are not one of those cases. On paper, the story is complete. It has already passed through every stage that the justice system can offer. An investigation was conducted. Evidence was collected. A theory of events was constructed from what could be recovered and what could be inferred. A courtroom examined that theory, tested it against defense arguments, and ultimately reached a conclusion. A sentence followed. Years were served. Time moved forward. And yet, even after all of that, the story does not feel finished. Because some cases are not defined by how they end in law. They are defined by what the law cannot return. Sandra Rallo was 29 years old. At that age, life is not a completed narrative. It is still in motion, still unfolding, still filled with plans that have not yet become memories. She was a mother of 2 young children, building a life around routines that, at the time, must have felt ordinary and unremarkable. Meals prepared in the same kitchen. Bedtime routines repeated night after night. Conversations that belonged to the rhythm of family life rather than history. Nothing about those days would have suggested that they would one day become part of a criminal record studied decades later. Stephanie Rallo was 5 years old. At 5, life is still pure possibility. There is no long memory of the world yet, no complex understanding of how fragile it can be. There is only trust. Trust in parents. Trust in home. Trust in the idea that tomorrow will always arrive in the same familiar shape as today. Jason Rallo was 6 years old. Old enough to explore, to ask questions, to begin forming memories that might have stayed with him for the rest of his life. Old enough to have a future that could have stretched forward in countless directions, each one still unwritten. But none of those futures were allowed to continue. And that is where this case becomes something different from many others. Because it is not only about what happened. It is about what never returned. Sandra was recovered. Stephanie was recovered. Their deaths were confirmed, documented, and recorded within the framework of forensic investigation and court proceedings. Their absence, while devastating, became part of a defined reality. There is a place in the world where their stories end, even if that ending is painful. Jason does not have that. There is no confirmed resting place. No physical point of closure. No location where grief can become grounded in something tangible. Instead, there is only absence. And absence does not behave like loss. Loss has structure. It has a beginning and a point of recognition. Absence does not. It continues without form, without boundaries, and without a final state that allows the mind to fully settle. This is why, even decades later, the most persistent question in the case is not about legal responsibility. That question was addressed in court. It was argued, examined, and decided within the limits of the justice system. The question that remains exists in a different space entirely. Where is Jason? That question is not simply a detail of the case. It has become the defining fracture inside it. Because it represents the one thing that time, investigation, and legal process have never been able to resolve. Over the years, the case has moved from active investigation to historical record. Files have been archived. Names have entered public memory. Generations have grown up hearing about it as something that belongs to the past. Something already decided. Something already finished. But for those who look deeper into it, the feeling is different. It does not feel finished. It feels paused in an unresolved moment that never fully closed. Time has a way of softening the edges of most stories. Details blur. Emotional intensity fades. New events replace old ones in public attention. But in some cases, time does not erase the central question. It only creates distance around it. And distance is not the same as resolution. It only means the world has continued moving while something remains unresolved in place. The courtroom provided its answer in the only way it could. Based on evidence, inference, and the legal standard of proof, it reached a conclusion. But the courtroom is not designed to reconstruct every missing piece of reality. It cannot restore what has been physically lost. It cannot return individuals who are no longer present. It cannot fill the gaps left behind by absence that leaves no trace. That is the limit of justice. It can assign responsibility, but it cannot always complete the picture. And so, in the years that followed, the case remained where many true crime stories eventually settle. Not in active investigation, not in legal uncertainty, but in a quieter space where everything has already been said, and yet something still feels unspoken. For the family connected to the victims, that space is not abstract. It is lived. It is carried forward. It exists in every unanswered question that returns in quiet moments. It exists in every reminder that one part of the story was never physically accounted for. It exists in the knowledge that while time has moved forward, one piece of it has never been recovered. This is what makes the Rallo family murders endure in memory. Not only the tragedy itself, but the incompleteness that follows it. Because some stories do not end when the investigation ends. Some do not end when the verdict is delivered. Some do not even end when the person responsible is no longer alive to answer questions. Some stories remain open in a way that time cannot fully close. And in those stories, what lingers is not only what happened. It is what remains missing. And in this case, what remains missing is still the most important question of all. Not because it changes the outcome of history, but because it defines the shape of everything that came after it. And so the story does not truly end here. It simply stops moving forward, and leaves behind a silence that continues to exist long after the words have ended.